IPR policy as it relates to the IRTF is similar to that which applies to the IETF. So if you haven't read this before, you should have a read of it. If you're aware of IPR that pertains to contributions to the meeting, you should let us know about that in a timely fashion. Today's slides should be available on the data tracker in the usual place, and the MeetEcho facilities are available for remote participation as well. There are a couple of mailing lists relating to the IRTF, which you can subscribe to keep up with announcements and discuss topics of relevance to the IRTF, and they're mentioned on the slide as well here. With that out of the way, we can get straight into the meat of today's meeting, which are our two Applied Networking Research Prize Award talks. As we have quite a long chunk of time here, but there's nothing in this room until after lunch, I've told both of our speakers that they should use as much time as they need to give their talk, and we'll use as much time as we need for questions as well. So we can be pretty relaxed about time here. The Applied Networking Research Prize is something that we award on an annual basis, and we have up to 2 prize winners at each IETF meeting. And today's prize winners are Roya and Safi and Zakir Darumaric. Roya is going to go first, and she's going to give us a talk about her work on understanding how the Chinese Great Firewall discovers hidden circumvention servers. So Roya, if you could come up, and we'll get you plugged in, and perhaps while Roya is doing that, we could give her a round of applause for her award. Slides, because I think the remote participation, I need you to stand down there and use that mic.
Oh man, that's just going to be...
Is that going to be difficult?
A little bit, yeah, it's more interactive than I thought. Do you think that I can use that one?
The clicker?
Yeah.
Right, but I don't think that's good.
Because then I can actually...
Yeah. Right, but I don't know how to get that to work with this thing.
Bad idea.
Okay. Can you skip that? Does it work anyway? There's an option to skip that.
Oh, dang it. I didn't see it.
Press the key menu to the right, the shift key. That's right.
Do that.
Or we could just put your laptop down there, if that helps.
I think it seems it works.
Does it work if you just push it once? No. Oh, something happened.
Yeah, something worked.
I think it's working.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I can't tell.
Actually. No.
I think it just, no, I don't think it works. I don't think it's working. I think it just goes into automatic.
Yeah,
mode.
exactly. Okay.
Well, if you want to put your laptop down there and drive it that way, then that might work. Sorry? So if you want to just hold it, that's up to you.
That one? Okay, perfect. Yes, exactly. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Roya Ensafi, and I'm currently a postdoc at Princeton University, working with Professor Nick Feimster, Weaver, and Vern Paxson. This is a joint work I did with two amazing Tor developers, David Fifield and Philip Winter. I hope I do them the justice by presenting this talk. For many of us, accessing different web servers is just typing it in a web browsers and then press enter. But that's not the same for many citizens around the world, especially if their governments practice internet censorship. Especially over the past few years, middle boxes technologies are becoming much more cheaper and affordable, and therefore many more governments started blocking information. On the other hand, citizens of these countries have developed skills to be able to circumvent censorship. And one common way for them to do so is by using proxy servers. So these governments not only have to make sure that their citizens cannot access to the content, but also they have to guarantee that proxy servers are blocked as well. A question I had was how these governments actually find these proxy servers, especially the hidden ones, and how they block it. To study this problem more systematically with greater details, we decided to focus on Chinese censorship apparatus. Not only because China has a sophisticated censorship system, but also because other suppressive regimes look up to them. It wasn't long back ago when China announced actually that they're helping another suppressive regime with their national firewall. So I strongly believe that the more we know about how Great Firewall is implemented and architected, the better we can help circumvention tool designers to have a realistic understanding of what a national firewall can do and cannot do. And therefore, they come up with tools that are practical and sustainable. We focus on Tor and the relationship between Great Firewall and Tor because it has been a decades of arms race between Great Firewall and Tor. And therefore, it makes it an interesting and complicated problem to study. So let me go over the arms race, and through that steps, I cover some background knowledge that is necessary for you to understand our work. It was more than 10 years ago when Tor became popular in China, and thousands of their citizens started to use Tor to circumvent internet censorship. Therefore, Great Firewall went after them. At the time, Tor only published Tor relays, the list of IPs online. And it was easy for Great Firewall to download this list of IP, which was around 6,000 of them, and block them all. They were successful for a while at blocking Tor, but soon after, Tor developers came up with the idea of Tor Bridge DB. This is a list of IPs or relays that are private. They are not announced them publicly, and therefore it's not easy for any government to actually download them and block them. I bet you the Great Firewall tried manually to download and block bridges, Tor hidden relays or bridges, but soon after they realized they don't need to. Actually, they don't need to go find IPs for their proxies and block them that way. They just need to monitor their citizens' traffic by deploying a deep packet inspector and try to fingerprint Tor traffic. And when they observe such traffic, they block it that way, or they discover IPs of the proxies that way. Well, as it turns out, it's not that hard to fingerprint Tor traffic. The TLS handshakes of Tor. First of all, the TLS handshake is unencrypted, and second, the Tor TLS handshake has some peculiarities in it, which makes it simpler to fingerprint. Specifically, Great Firewall look at the cipher list, and the cipher list is it's very easy to see. By looking at the cipher list, it's very easy to see that is Tor related. And that was the way they actually started fingerprinting Tor traffic and block it. That went well until Tor developers came up with the idea of Tor pluggable transport. And the goal was to wrap Tor traffic in another protocol that makes it harder for any deep packet inspector to detect inside that protocol, which it was Tor handshake. We have different pluggable transfer. Currently, we have 5 version of it, but it started with obfuscation 2, and the goal was to make the Tor traffic looks like uniformly random. The problem with the first version was by looking at the first 20 bytes, you could decrypt the rest, and therefore you can easily and reliably detect Tor traffic that way. So they upgraded it to OPS 3, which does a good job in hiding Tor traffic. Enough that for firewalls to be able to detect Tor traffic, they have to make a bet. So there is a high chance that they end up with false positive. And as you know, for any national firewall, false positive was scary because it caused collateral damage, especially in China, because there are millions of users at a time using the internet. So even for a short time, if they cause disruption, it will be detected by public and it will cause anger. So how Great Firewall deal with that? They added the active probing to their DPI fingerprinting. So let me walk you through how Great Firewall actually find Tor hidden circumvention servers. First, they monitor the network traffic. Specifically, they look at the Tor, they look at the TLS, and for Tor, they look at the TLS client hello. If they find something similar to what they want to block, then they initiate or fire a short-lived active probe by speaking the protocol to the server, destination IP to the server. And if they succeed at talking to that server, if the handshake happened, then they know for sure that is the Tor bridge or Tor relay. And therefore, they block it. So as of now, the arms race look like that. DPI plus active probing. This is amazing. It means that they actively go after the proxy servers. And when I started this problem, I've noticed that we don't have any comprehensive picture of how this active probing happening and like how it's implemented. Is it only for Tor? Because it was only Tor blogs and Philip Winter's work that shed lights on this phenomenon. So we started to run our own comprehensive measurements. First, we did something that makes sense. Basically, to answer this type of questions, we needed to see what the client in China does and experience and capture that. So we started renting VPS machines inside 2 ISPs in China. My previous work suggested that Unicom, which is the most used ISP in China, being treated differently from the CERNET, which is Chinese Educational Research Network. So we gathered VPS in both of these ISPs, and we established private Tor bridges, each of them hosting different obfuscations. And we continuously and repeatedly connect from our clients to this list of bridges. We call this data set shadow data set because we put a huge effort in making sure that no one else know about the IP of our bridges. Basically, we make sure that none of these bridges talk to Tor authorities for giving a stat, or the next relay that they have to connect, they don't directly connect to, so they go through another proxy and then they connect. So no one should know about it unless they observe the traffic from our client to bridges. We ran this measurement for 3 months and we learned a lot, but that wasn't enough. So we started another experiment, which is honestly is really interesting because our previous work showed that Tor is being blocked by IP port. It means that the O port is blocked, but not the rest of the ports. So what we did is we redirect 600 ports to O ports. And then from our client in China, we established connection to all of them, one by one. In the eye of a great firewall, it looked like we suddenly connected to 600 Tor relays. This experiment lasted for 2 hours, and we captured for 22 hours pickup, and we learned a lot about active probings just by this experiment. We also were fortunate that one of our colleagues had 5 years of server logs, and the web server hosted the Tor bridge at the same time. So that is a very limited log we had, but still taught us a lot about when active probing started. Did Great Firewall active probe other protocols or not? So we had PCAPs like this, lots of PCAPs, lots of experiments. The first question we asked, how can we make sure that these are active probers coming from China? How do we distinguish that? Well, for the civil data set, the one that we sent to different ports, it was easy because all the probes showed up after we established a connection from our client to the bridge. So that was easy. And we used MaxMindDB, paid version, obviously. And we found that all of them are in China, all the IPs that showed up. So we knew that they are active probers. For the other data set, we adopted the algorithm. So basically, we started looking at the cipher suit of the client hello. And if it was Tor related, then we knew it is a vanilla bridge probe. If we look at the first 20 bytes, if we could actually decrypt the rest, then we knew it's a ups to bridge probe, and so on and so forth. So give a guess. How many active probers do you think we've observed? How many unique IPs do you think we've observed? It was shocking to see that we've seen more than 16,000 unique IP addresses actively probing us. In the civil data set, the one that lasted for only 2 hours and the PCAP capture was running for 22, we saw more than 1,000 unique IP addresses. Interestingly, IPs weren't, 95% of the IPs appeared only once. And the IP that was shared among all of our data set was Great Firewall famous IP. So 50% of the traffic we've observed was from that IP, and previous work of ours and other people suggested that is one of the Great Firewall scanning machine, which recently went down after our publication, and before that it has open SSH port open. So where are these 16,000 IPs, or what is special about them? First, we did a reverse DNS lookup, and we saw a string such as ADSL. So it suggests that they are coming from an ISP pool, and they are coming from a famous autonomous system of Great Firewall, of China, sorry. We did trace routes, we did port scan, all of them, but we didn't learn anything special about the IPs. Actually, trace routes ended up getting dropped to hop in the country. This is where the Great Firewall actually located. So I started to talk and by saying that Great Firewall started fingerprinting Tor traffic. We were interested to know that can we fingerprint active probers? And for that, we started looking at all the OSI model layer. So we started by looking at IP layer and what is common about it, TCP layer, what is common about all these active probers that showed up. We saw a lot of shocking patterns, but specifically and interestingly, for the timestamp value in a TCP layer, we found out that obviously a linear pattern, especially in Sibyl experiment. As you know, timestamp roughly shows system uptime, and for packets that originated from 1,000 probers IP, we shouldn't have seen such a striking pattern. So what this suggests by itself is Great Firewall operate a handful physical machines that does the active probing. We found another interesting pattern in initial sequence number. As you all know, initial sequence number should be assigned randomly. It protects us against off-pass attackers, and therefore it shouldn't be guessable. But when you look at the ISN number in SIM segments, you see basically a linear improvement and then increment and then wrap around, and that goes forever. And we found a lot of more interesting patterns in the other layers. But what all these patterns actually mean, it means that we can actually fingerprint active probers. And it also suggests that these thousands of IP addresses are centrally controlled. More importantly, I think, in my opinion, it suggests that Great Firewall has their own user space TCP stack, which actually led to something like that. Well, let's focus a little bit on usability and effectiveness. Assume your friend in China asked you to set up a private bridge for him, and you did, and he started to establish a Tor connection to use the bridge. How long do you think it takes for the Great Firewall to active probe and come after you? Well, our measurement showed that they come after you in real time. Actually, for the Sibyl experiment, I go back in that 2 hours experiment, but for that specifically, we saw that for more than 56% of the probes, they came immediately. The probers showed immediately. And for the rest, the median was 500 milliseconds. This is like 3 years ago, we did the same type of experiment, and we figured that it's happening every 15 minutes, but they upgraded the system in the past 2 years, and it's right now in real time happening. How successful is active probing? I mean, we ran a 3-month measurements from our clients in China to Tor bridges, our Tor bridges, what the reachability looked like. First, for Tor vanilla, which is very easy to fingerprint, we found that it's almost always blocked, but we found something more interesting, and that is those dots that you see. Basically, roughly every 25 hours, our client in China could establish a Tor handshake to our bridges. That's, we speculate that is because they update their access list and they go to fail open for a short time, almost 30 minutes every day. So that is nice to observe. And strangely enough, we observe obfuscation 2 and 3 almost always reachable. That is weird because we found evidence of the active prober shows up at our probes, our bridges. So they detect us, but for some reason, they don't yet want to block us. So we don't know why that is the case. Well, this research was quite interesting. It shed lights on many things about Great Firewall of China. For example, we found out that they have been up their games in blocking Tor. They have a large amounts of IP addresses that they use to actively probe. So thinking about blacklisting active probers' IP is meaningless. And more importantly, we found out Tor pluggable transfer led to the Great Firewall have their own pluggable censorship. So, so that's basically the talk. But for this project, we did more than just doing the research and publishing. We actually have a project page in which we release all the PCAPs for our log and CBIL dataset, and also we have tutorial about how you can actually find active probers in your server logs. And please contact us if you saw something interesting or if you have any data sets that seems interesting. That's it.
Thanks very much, Roy. Are there any questions? I had one. I was wondering whether there was any risk of prosecution or worse for the measurement clients that you were using in China, or were they going to connect to Tor anyway?
So ethics is a big issue when we're dealing with any censorship measurement, but specifically, so internal knowledge is the key. So we knew that China doesn't go after anybody connecting to Tor, and there weren't any previous persecution or something like that in China. Actually, China doesn't care about that. They just want to make sure the majority of the people don't get access to the proxy servers. So you can set up your own proxy servers as long as like you have a limited number of users, they don't care. So that was already a good baseline for being able to do this measurement.
Okay, Nalini Elkins, great presentation. I'm just curious if the IP addresses, if you saw V4 addresses or V6 or both.
So we only looked at the IPv4. Actually, there is a common rumor that IPv6 is not being blocked or no one goes after IPv6 because yet middle boxes hadn't caught up to blocking them, but we haven't looked into it.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Planka, Akamai. Her question is actually a good lead into what I was going to ask about is I'm monitoring V6, and what I noticed is the only place I see V6 from China is coming across research and education networks. They seem to somehow find the way into Internet 2, and I was wondering, maybe you don't know, but then maybe I'll just ask the audience in general, do we know, are people really getting around it? I mean, I'm definitely seeing some evidence of them coming across and hitting Internet 2 located machines, and presumably it's, treated differently somehow, but maybe in the V4 space, did you see a difference between the RNE networks and them coming into, say, for instance, in the States, Internet 2 versus commercial located Tor bridges?
Yes, as I mentioned, the main reason why we chose CERNET also to consider CERNET and Unicom was because of the observation that CERNET is being treated differently. And there are rumors that like business part of the country like Shanghai, I think, it might have a more relaxed firewall rules because of the business reason and economical reason behind it, but we haven't looked into. My previous work on Great Firewall, which is the title is Great Firewall Over Time and Space, was trying to investigate that. Basically, I use special side channels to choose client all over the map of China and try to see whether Tor is being blocked differently in different locations in China. And I didn't find any reason to accept that Great Firewall is being treated differently from region to region. For the DNS layer, another colleagues of mine did this investigation, and they couldn't also see any bias towards DNS, regional DNS manipulation, except the ISPs, for example, play around. But basically, I don't think It's a very contradictory results we're seeing. For Tor, I can say that it's happening at a 2-hop inside the country by some central system. So.
All right, thanks. I think this thing about this bifurcation in the V4, V6 internet is interesting because largely we rely on it being the same. And it's one of the few examples where I've seen there's definitely people in a major region like China that can get there on one method.
One thing I noticed is Great Firewall keep upgrading their firewall or their development. So maybe we can motivate them to come after IPv6 just to see how they can do, or like set up something that majority of people start using, and therefore we see how the firewall actually react.
Steve Padgett, Google. Question: you mentioned that both the regular plain vanilla Tor was the one that was blocked, and the other one that was obfuscated was not. But you also said that the DPI could detect the active Tor, right?
Yes.
So, do you think it's likely that, like the DPI is what's doing the blocking as opposed to the active probing? Or I mean, how do you know that the active probing is generating most?
We see the IPs of active probers showing up at our private bridges.
But do you think that's the reason they're being blocked, or do you think it's because of DPI? The DPI first detect the IP of the bridges, and then the active probers confirm that it is running the protocol and therefore blocking. So it might be the DPI is separated, and I think it is separated from the active probers, obviously, but I don't know. I'm wondering if you get if one signal comes through but not the other, what would happen? Right? What if active probing, or what if DPI detected it but active probing did not?
Active probing gets the input from the DPI.
Yeah,
it might selectively choose to active probe or not.
But I mean, what if active probing then fails?
Oh, okay. For a while, actually, Tor started to do that. So they tried to detect whether the active prober is coming from China, and therefore they didn't respond back. So that was their way of actually dealing with active probers. So they couldn't make a conclusion that is Tor. So yeah, that is possible. Active probing.
Did it work?
It's a temporary solution. It's like patching it. They try to upgrade the pluggable transfer to OPS4, and for now, we think that OPS4 is safe, so they haven't yet figured that part out.
Hi. Do you have any plans on looking at other national firewalls?
Sorry, who are you?
Dino. Any other national firewalls, like maybe North Korea, to see how they behaves differently?
Yes, we actually do study other national firewalls, but yet we haven't published. But we know China leads the way, and the other countries follows. So it would be interesting to see how different, for example, other countries actually like implement their national firewall. And therefore, if we see the same technology, we can actually say that Great Firewall is selling it. So.
I had one other question. This is obviously an arms race. So could you care to speculate on what the next steps in obfuscation technology might be? I mean, what do we just connect to Tor every 25 hours, or
My suggestion was every 24 hours we ask users to connect to Tor authority directories to get the latest Tor relays or Tor bridges IP, but these are all patching it. So the current pluggable transfer OPS4 is being used in China. And also we have obfuscation is one way to go around the Great Firewall's DPIs. We have MEEK, Tor has MEEK or other type of pluggable transfer that right now works. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Daoyan. So I'm living in China, so I experienced the inconvenience to access some website. So my question is, so you think the Great Wall Firewall is using DPI to detect the protocol, but if the DPI one has the real-time response to the setup procedure, to in the every border internet. I mean the internet the border, the throughput. I mean the performance. What kind of DPI device can provide this kind of higher throughput to provide this?
Good question. It was actually for us very interesting to be able to answer this question as well, because it's like first they have to monitor billions of traffic, and at the same time then detect that and then probe it. We think so. Previously, 3 years ago, we've observed that every 15 minutes the probe showed up. So it was obvious that the DPI dumped the IPs that they are suspicious about, and then another system fetched that and active probe, and every 15 minutes. But I think that's just become much more faster. So I don't know about the technology that they are using. It's hard to actually be able to know that. I think they are in a state that they can come up with their own technology, but I don't have a firm answer for that.
Yeah, but in terms of the current throughput, I don't think it's possible to do this kind of work in real time.
That is
You're
why,
by using the DPI.
So see, that's how surprising our observation was, because the relay we have, it was a private relay. So and the connection we established from China, like no one knew about it. So basically they had to monitor the traffic, and then all the probes happened immediately after our probe from the client in China happened. And by the way, the VPS we used is not the same as the previous one. So we had a new VPS machine that did this new probe in a CBL data set. And the fact that we've seen thousands active probers showed up, more than 50 of them in real time, immediately, that is shocking. That's actually an interesting surprise and result we saw.
Okay, thank you.
I just want questions. Sorry, I just want questions. It was not clear to me. I mean, the traffic between the client and the Tor is actually encrypted, right? So how the active Tors can, decrypt it?
So the TLS handshake is unencrypted, and
Okay.
And if it's not obfuscated, but the vanilla version, so you can easily see the Tor cipher suit, like the cipher list that a client sent to a Tor bridge to announce what type of protocols they actually ciphers they actually support. And by just looking at that, you could fingerprint Tor traffic. It's in a handshake.
Yeah, but it's, it's happening, very fast. It must be, it's happening, very fast on the connection, about, only a few milliseconds in the connection, the handshake. And so they catch it in this period of time?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Hi, Nalini Elkins again. Did you guys take a look at layer 2 addresses at all? I'm just curious because I think you were saying that they had a multiple layer 3 addresses, and it seemed like they were all coming from one particular thing. So was it like, because from the layer 2 you can see, is it a VM or, just kind of, did any kind of analysis of the MAC address or any of that? Just curious.
A good question, a very good question. Actually, I don't know on top of my head, but I know we went layer by layer, and we didn't see any special pattern. Otherwise, I would remember it. So I don't think we did see anything special about the layer 2.
But layer 2, sorry, and if I can ask another question, is it different from a device, like if your client is a phone versus, or wireless, or versus a desktop, or any of that? Just out of curiosity.
I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I
just
look
curious.
into it.
Yeah, thank you.
Rafael, I'm just curious if you could see some probes sending from China sending to outside China to block the traffic that was passing through China. Could you find some outliers?
Can you repeat your question?
I mean, could you find that China, the Great Fire, was sending probes to outside China to find another Tor bridge outside China to block the traffic that was passing through China?
Not, but actually you point at something interesting, which is how do you know that the Great Firewall doesn't Z-map internet for finding, for example, Tor bridges or here. So we had a control bridges set up. We had like it was a shadow infrastructure. So we had for every our bridges, we had another bridge set up that we didn't establish any connection from China to it. And it was reside in the same as /24. And in those control bridges, we didn't see the traffic. So we are sure that they are coming after us because they observe the traffic.
Okay, thank you. Great work.
Right, well, if there are no more questions, then let's thank Roya again for her very interesting talk.
Thanks.
Our second prize winner is Zakir Derumeric, who's going to talk to us about an empirical analysis of email delivery security. And while he gets set up, I'll mention that the beginning of Zakir's paper, the title is Neither Snow Nor Rain, which if you come from Scotland like I do, sounds very familiar. So this should be interesting. But anyway, let's congratulate Zakir on his award.
Thank you. So this was a large collaboration between the Gmail and abuse team at Google, the University of Michigan, and University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign that essentially set off to say, what is the current state of email security? When you send an email, what's really happening behind the scenes? Because this is really this kind of opaque ecosystem to the end user. Only the mail operators really know what is going on, but the end user doesn't see any indication, was an email encrypted or was it not? My work has focused on a long time on essentially developing tools for doing internet-wide measurement. A lot of this has been around scanning and ZMAP. And then essentially, given a global perspective of how the internet works, what devices are on the internet or what traffic you can see, how do we essentially better understand how to secure systems? In the past, we'd like to take apart protocols. We'd like to take apart devices to figure out their security, but there's also this perspective of looking at these data sets and trying to understand what's going on in the real world and developing protocols based on that. So this will be a little bit of background about email. I think to anyone in the mail community, this should be obvious, but may not be to others. So when you go ahead and send an email, whether this be from your Thunderbird client on your machine or through the web interface of your mail provider, essentially what happens is this email is sent to your organization's SMTP server over what we call Smtp Submission. And essentially you're delivering the message to your organization and they take possession of it and they say, we will make sure to get this to the destination later on the internet. You don't have to worry about it. If you close your laptop, it doesn't matter, we'll get it there. After that, that server goes ahead and it does what we call an MX record lookup for the destination domain. It essentially says, I am trying to send mail to gmail.com. What server should I send it to? It sends up this mail exchange request, which essentially Gmail's DNS server says connect to smtp1.gmail.com. It does a second resolution to say what is the IP address of that server, at which point it initiates a connection to the SMTP server for gmail.com over what we call Smtp Delivery. And these two SMTP protocols are nearly identical but operate on different ports and are essentially just responsible for a different piece within this puzzle. After which the user essentially can come to their email provider and say, I want to retrieve my email through POP3 or through IMAP, and they can collect their message. So the first and last step of this essentially operates very similarly to how TLS works in HTTPS when we want to provide security. Essentially, if your organization supports TLS for mail, either submission or mail retrieval, when you connect, you start a TLS connection to a different port. You deliver that, you essentially do a normal TLS connection, you send the client hello, the server sends the server hello, you validate the name of the certificate. If the name doesn't validate, you throw an error. If everything looks good, you go ahead, you complete the TLS session, and then you do the SMTP or pop your IMAP handshake to send or retrieve your mail. What I want to focus on kind of is this piece in the middle, or what we call SMTP Delivery. And essentially, this is the piece that says, how do I get a piece of mail from the University of Michigan to Gmail or to a different organization that goes across the internet, or what we call SMTP Delivery. So SMTP, when it originally built, had no built-in security. Your email was sent clear text over the internet, and when someone received an email, they essentially believed whoever sent it was not posing as someone else, that it was all true. And as time went on, we realized this probably was not quite the guarantee we wanted to be providing for email. So we essentially developed extensions that we added onto SMTP to essentially allow transport layer security and also to authenticate email on receipt that were really driven by kind of some of the spam problems that were happening in the community. And so servers have been deploying these protocols kind of behind the scenes, but all of it is kind of voluntary and hidden to the users. There isn't an immediate incentive for an operator to deploy these extensions because their users probably will never know one way or the other. So I mentioned we have these extensions to SMTP. The first one is Start TLS, which essentially allows a TLS session to be started within an SMTP handshake. You essentially start the SMTP and say, I'm speaking SMTP, I want to deliver mail, and then you go ahead and start a TLS handshake, which is kind of the flip of what we usually see where we start TLS and then go ahead and do the mail handshake within TLS. But the motive is essentially the same. We want to mostly protect against passive eavesdroppers and maybe try to authenticate who we're trying to send mail to. And so the protocol is fairly simple. You start an SMTP connection. You say, hello, I want to deliver mail. The server essentially says, these are the features I support. And these can be, well, I support compression, or I support eSMTP, but it can also say, I support this start TLS command. And if the client also supports start TLS, it sends this start TLS command, and then they go ahead and they do a normal TLS handshake, at which point they later on continue to send mail. And the big difference, I think, between this and what we normally think about TLS is that start TLS is opportunistic. And essentially, when the RFC was originally written, the way it was written said, a server should never not deliver a piece of mail because it can't start a TLS connection. We're kind of deploying this later on. It's a tacked-on extension. In the beginning, no one is going to support TLS. Later on, deployment is going to be gradual. So try to encrypt the message if you can. But if you can't, that's okay. Still deliver the message. And so we ended up in this weird world where this led to essentially servers not validating the certificates of anyone they delivered mail to, because essentially your option would be to validate the certificate, see that it's expired, and say, I really don't like that expired certificate, so I'm going to now send you mail in clear text. Or to say, well, I don't really like your expired certificate, but sending something using some encryption sure seems better than doing nothing. And so we kind of chose that latter where you would essentially deliver mail no matter what the server presented to you. And this provided this opportunistic encryption against passive eavesdroppers, but really it has no protection against an active adversary. It's also kind of important to note here that it's not immediately obvious what name you should validate. Because there's this kind of intermediate step where you go to Gmail and you say, what is your MX server? What's your mail exchange server? And you get back a name. And then you look up the IP address of that name. And so there you see these two stages where sometimes you put the name of the server you're connecting to, and sometimes you put the destination domain. When you put the name of the host, it really doesn't do anything if your DNS isn't authenticated, which is the case for most people in the world right now, because essentially a man in the middle just tells you the name of the attacker-controlled domain, and they can easily get a CA signed certificate for that domain. And when you put the actual name of the destination domain, we have this problem where we have these huge mail providers that are responsible for hundreds of thousands of domains. And so Gmail doesn't necessarily have a method right now to present a certificate for each domain that it has, or for someone to say, I want to give you a certificate that you can only use for mail. But before we even get that far, the question is, well, what percentage of people in the world even support star TLS at all? Here we're looking at all the connections that came in and out of Gmail, essentially over the last 2 years. And overall, this looks fairly positive. We've seen like a pretty massive growth over the last couple of years. It looks like we're making progress. At the same time, though, we're only really able to encrypt 80% of traffic that's leaving and only about 60% of traffic that's coming in. And it's even worse when you kind of consider the shape of this curve. And what's happening is there's a couple of very large mail providers, and then there's this very long tail. And so these big jumps happen when large providers decide they're going to support star TLS and they deploy it. But if you remove these big hops, the progress is fairly slow between the rest of the tail, the people who aren't in the top 10 providers. And when you zoom in a little bit more, look at this a higher resolution, you actually see this very funny zigzag pattern that's going back and forth. And what we see here is actually the difference between the amount of mail that is encrypted on weekends versus weekdays. And how it turns out is that on weekends, about 10% more of mail is encrypted than on weekdays. And the idea essentially that leads to this is that, well, people go home on the weekends, they use their personal email account, they send an email from their Gmail account to their friend's Yahoo account, and these large providers support star TLS, they support this transport security, but then they go back on the weekdays and they go back to their job, and the companies they work at are not doing as well as deploying this because they're maintaining their own mail servers. A lot of them are not using these providers. And we also see this kind of almost 20% drop right around the pool vulnerability, which is a little bit mysterious, but essentially this happened when the poodle vulnerability was a vulnerability in TLS that affected SSL-v3. And we told essentially everyone, go out and disable SSL-v3. Like, no, people don't really use this anymore. It's a deprecated protocol. If you disable this, it's not going to really affect many clients. But what seems to have happened is people disabled TLS altogether. They had good intentions, but they ended up inadvertently turning this off at the same time, and then came back a few days later, realized something had gone awry, and turned it back on. And I guess the takeaway here is kind of just the fragility of this ecosystem. You don't see these major drops like this in the HTTPS space, but in the mail space, it's not quite as pretty. We've kind of been ignoring it for a while. For this long tail of operators, we look at the top 1,000,000 web domains, which isn't necessarily the top 1,000,000 mail domains, but gives you a decent sense of who the big companies are, who are the people who are sending mail. Only about 80% of organizations support star TLS at all. And that's rather discouraging. Within that space, about 35% have certificates that match the host, and about 0.5% have certificates that match the domain. And so we've really, even though we have essentially asked to deploy star TLS quite a while ago, many years we've been trying to deploy this, we're really not in the spot where we can require it yet. When 20% of these mail servers say, we can't accept mail over star TLS, we can't say today, we're not going to deliver mail if it's not encrypted. And if you look at the software that is being commonly used to send mail, a lot of the defaults actually don't even support encryption right now. And there's kind of this mess between package distributors and mail organizations as to who configures this. But at the end of the day, there are common mail software that don't even attempt to try to start a star TLS connection to attempt to send your mail over an encrypted setting. And so we have this somewhat broken ecosystem where you can be a victim to an active attack at any time, given that this is called all opportunistic. And so kind of what the simplest idea would be, well, if you're an active attacker, what is the most naive, simple attack you could do to essentially read someone's email? And that essentially would be just to corrupt really any part of the TLS handshake. Because no matter what happens, the server is just going to say, well, you don't support star TLS, and I will just go back to clear text. And so an easy way of doing this is to prevent the TLS handshake from ever happening. And that's to say you could just garble the announcement that says I support star TLS and replace it with something else. or when the client sends a start TLS message, you garble the command and the server says, I don't know what command you sent me, and they say, okay, I'll send mail over clear text. So we call this the start TLS stripping attack, and it really is this most naive attack. But what we see in the real world is rather surprising. So here's the percentage of mail that Gmail receives from each of these countries that is prevented from starting a start TLS connection by something between the two servers. So, I mean, the numbers here are surprising. In Tunisia, it's close to 100% of mail is actually not encrypted, and it shows this evidence of tampering. And essentially, the way we can look for this is we do a scan of the entire IPv4 address space, and we look at the commands that come back. And you can tell what's been garbled because these aren't real commands that come back. They're gibberish, or a lot of times they're just X's. And essentially, the device in the middle will take the command and they'll replace each letter of it just with X. And so the length of the packet all stays the same, but then you just need to recompute the checksum of this packet and send it along, and you've prevented this connection. When you look at the kind of continuing list of countries, you start to see everybody. You start to see European nations, Asian nations, the United States. You start to see everyone. And the numbers are small in some cases. But this seems to be happening everywhere, that people are being prevented from starting these start TLS connections and are sending mail in the clear as such. It's not necessarily malicious, though. It's not entirely clear that actually that mail operators know what's going on. There are a couple of products out there that essentially advertise the ability to protect your mail. And this, the way they say we're going to protect your mail from attacks, whether they be buffer overflows or addresses that you've blacklisted, is we essentially need to be able to read your mail. And so to do that, we're going to prevent these start TLS connections from ever happening. And so what a lot of this looks like is that either organizations or ISPs have deployed these essentially middle boxes that they believe are adding security, that are allowing them to look at the mail, but these middle boxes are not terminating this TLS connection and restarting it to look at the mail and to protect it. Instead, they're just breaking the TLS connection from ever occurring in order to do this, and that inadvertently means that all of your mail is sent in clear across the internet. We see this happening in almost every sector. A lot of these are corporations, but we see this in almost everywhere you look, you can find an example of this happening. Another attack that you can imagine is if your DNS is not authenticated, then nothing really prevents a DNS server from just lying to you about what the IP address is for the mail server. So you go to your DNS server and you say, hi, I would like to essentially relay mail over to Gmail. Can you give me the MX record for Gmail? And the server says, sure, the IP address you need to connect to is X. And you connect to X and you give them your mail. Because you don't validate your certificate, you really have no idea whether or not that is or is not Gmail. And so that you send your mail to your malicious party, and who knows what they do with it. Maybe they alter it, maybe they just store it to disk, maybe they don't do either of those. And then they send it on to Gmail, and you don't really know that there's been this extra hop in the middle. So the way we look for this is a little bit ugly. We know that there should not be DNS open resolvers on the internet. In the perfect world, we would not be seeing this happening. But there still exists out there where you can connect essentially these servers that are out there and say, what is the MX record for gmail.com? What is the IP address for this SMTP server? And they'll give you what they think the answer is. And when you look at these, most of these answers are obviously not correct, but they're obviously not necessarily malicious either. They're these really just bad embedded devices that they don't know the IP address is something, they'll make one up. Some of them will just always give you local hosts. There are devices out there that will actually just give you an incrementing counter. Every time you ask for the IP address of something and it doesn't know, it has some global counter increments. Could not for the life of you tell you why that is the case, but we see these out there. But we have this set of IP addresses that have been returned by DNS servers as people that will take your mail. And so we attempt to send mail to those servers and see if it arrives at Gmail, and whether the host that's been given back to you by that DNS server actually acts as a mail proxy. We see a much lower number of messages that come through to Gmail from a server that has been essentially, that is posing as a Gmail server, but we do still see it happening. It's hard to know whether these numbers, how close these numbers are to the upper bound. These are very much a lower bound because of this methodology. But again, is a kind of a sign that like these active attacks actually are happening in practice. People are delivering mail through these servers when they have really no idea who they are. So that's kind of the state of transport security. It's not a particularly happy state. The big providers are doing things well. The rest of the tail is kind of lagging behind. And this opportunistic protocol really isn't quite doing what I think most people outside of our community would really expect when they send a message. I think people expect that there's some sort of security when they send something. And the other note I would make is a lot of times people will say, well, if you want email security, you should be using PGP or SMIME. But really, these are kind of orthogonal problems. PGP and SMIME are not quite to the point where there's widespread use. The interfaces are just not quite there yet. And so the majority of people rely on this transport layer security for protecting email. So in terms of authenticating mail, there are again a couple of protocols that are commonly used. Probably the foremost is called DKIM, which essentially allows a sender to sign a message, provide a cryptographic signature and an additional header on the message. And then when the recipient receives the message, they can look up the public key for that sender and verify that that message was not altered somewhere on the path. DKIM unfortunately has this kind of odd property that each message can essentially designate a different public key or different key pair that is used to sign that message. And because of that, there isn't actually a way for the receiver to realize whether that sender should have signed the message. And so essentially an easy attack here is you just remove the signature. And if that receiver hasn't received mail from you before, they aren't paying attention to whether mail from you before has been signed, they don't really have a way of knowing whether that message should have been signed. SPF is another protocol that essentially allows a sender to publish the IP addresses or the hosts or networks that are allowed to send mail for it. And essentially the receiver will check the IP address that it got mail from, and it'll say, this did not originate from one of your MX servers or one of your IP addresses. I'm going to reject it. It came from somewhere else on the IP space. And then there's the last standard called DMARC, which essentially allows an organization to publish the rules that it wants the receiver to follow. And so if it says you should expect all mail from me to be DKIM signed, and if it's not, I want you to quarantine it, or I want you to trash it, or I want you to report it back to me but still deliver it to the user so I know what's going on. From the Gmail perspective, things are not too bad. 94% of messages are essentially verified with DKIM or SPF or some combination of both. There's only 6% of messages that don't have some sort of indicator that they came from the right person. But again, when you look at this long tail, you see a slightly different picture, which is that less than half of the domains that are sending mail have any SPF policy defined, and about 1% have a DMARC policy, of which very few are actually willing to say, trash or quarantine the messages that don't match my policy. In the case of empty, essentially it means just report the messages back to me. So we're again in this kind of world where we're lagging behind in getting these to the rest of the world. Moving forward, there is a draft that is currently in conversation in the application use of TLS working group called Strict Transport Security, which is similar to the idea of key pinning or to STS or HSTS and HTTPS world that says, let's have some way for an organization to say you should only deliver mail to me over Start TLS. And if you can't, I want you to report it to me, or I don't want you to deliver that mail at all. And so that's in a fairly early draft right now. But I think we're optimistic. The meeting yesterday, there was good reception to this idea of we need to provide something further. And in the kind of the authentication side, there is a draft called ARC, which essentially helps bridge some of the shortcomings that are in DKIM that have prevented it from being deployed in the real world. So we looked at data kind of from 2015, the slide. I want to quickly mention one recent change, which is that the Google team essentially deployed indicators that say whether or not a message was sent securely when they received it, or whether the first hop they're sending to can be protected over Start TLS. And if you use Google Mail, you may have seen these icons. But what's interesting is that there actually has been growth in the amount of messages that are protected by Start TLS after this was deployed. Google has put out a blog post to have some more details of what they've seen. But it is encouraging that we're, again, kind of starting to see the line start to go back upwards, but we're still far from where I think we want to be today. So providers are continuing to roll out transport security. The last slide we saw, it's starting to get better. People are starting to look at it and think about it. But we're still in the state where we don't have a protocol that really protects against active attacks. And we're going to continue to deliver the mail no matter what. And that's kind of where this title comes from, is neither snow nor rain nor man in the middle nor whatever else comes along your path, that mail is going to go through. The user doesn't know, but it may or may not be encrypted or may not be altered, but that's where we're in today. Questions?
Hi, Dave Oran, Cisco. Did you ever backtrace from received spam or phishing attacks to figure out whether Start TLS is actually helping in any regard, or is there sort of no correlation between how bad from a social engineering point of view the email coming in is versus the transport that was used to deliver it?
So I believe that less spam is protected with Start TLS, but I don't know if we know whether that affects what a user thinks about it or what it does with it. Until recently, there wasn't even the indicator for them to know, and so there wasn't much reason to be protected by Start TLS. And so, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I don't think we know today.
Eric Nordmark, on the next to last slide, you had a graph showing things slowly ticking up, but what's the scale on the y-axis?
I'm sorry. Yes, this is truncated, but it is. This is percent. So it's 65%, 70%, 75%.
Okay, so it's not
inbound mail to Gmail.
Okay, it's not 0.65%.
Yes, I'm sorry. You're absolutely correct.
Hey, Steve Paget, Google. In one of the earlier slides, it showed something like 0.4% of certificates were actually properly created. Is that correct? Like 99.6% or so, whatever it was, of certificates are not actually properly deployed on mail servers?
Correct. And that is that have the name of the domain itself, not of the host. So that is a C up to the NSS browser store, to the Microsoft browser, or to the CA store that you have signed for the domain and it links up correctly.
But like 36% was still signed or properly associated with the MX server.
Correct, they're
right?
signed with the MX, yes.
Do we need to do something to like get people to understand how they're supposed to do this? Because if 99.6% are wrong, that seems like a problem.
I agree. We've ended up in this weird problem where we kind of have this cat and mouse, where it's hard to encourage people to deploy the right thing if no one validates it. But then we don't validate anything because no one deploys the right thing. I think there are also a couple of roadblocks in terms of actually having certificates that have the domain, which is these large cloud providers. Right now, we don't have an obvious solution where we can say this is how a large mail provider should present a certificate for each of those domains. So I would say, yes, this is a problem. We do want to be at the point where we can authenticate where we are sending our mail, but there are a couple of roadblocks before we can give an absolute piece of advice as to how to do that.
Ulrich Wisser, IIS. You didn't mention Dane.
Yes, so Dane does help solve this, particularly with when you have a certificate that matches the host name, or if you wanted to provide some sort of key pinning. I think the problem is, and the reason these drafts have been put out, is that we're not at the point where Dane has been deployed widely. If Dane were widely used, if DNSSEC were widely checked, that would be a solution where we could say, go out and do this today. But it still requires a fair amount of effort for an organization to go down that path versus saying, I'm going to publish a DNS record that says what you should do about my server.
Well, thanks, Zakir. If there are no further questions, let's thank Zakir for his very interesting talk. And that's the end of our agenda, so thanks all for coming. And if you want to nominate good papers that you read, the nomination cycle for the ANRP for 2017 will open in the summer, around the sort of June, July timeframe, and we'll close, I think we typically close for nominations, I'm going to say at the end of October. So you have that window to let us know about great research that you see between now and then, and hopefully we'll get some of the more interesting talks at the IETF meetings next year. Dave, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if, since we have so much extra time, if we could keep Zakir for a couple of minutes. I would love you to tell us about the current state of ZMAP and Census, if you could. I think it's a wonderful infrastructure, and some people probably don't know what it is, but also I want to know maybe where you are with V6 with it too.
Sure. For those who don't know, ZMAP is an open source project that was released, I believe, 3 years ago now, that essentially allows you to perform a single port, horizontal port scan of the entire IPv4 address space in an hour using a 1 gigabit connection. And essentially this has been widely used within the research community for understanding how TLS has been deployed, for working with CERT groups to essentially do notifications about embedded devices and SCADA devices that are out there. But it gives us kind of a new perspective of how the world operates. I think the problem that happened with ZMAP when we put it out is that we released this tool that worked, but people did not necessarily have the bandwidth or the infrastructure to do this. It requires high quality network equipment to kind of have this packet per second throughput, and it requires kind of an IT infrastructure and a legal infrastructure to back up researchers. And so we had this tool that allowed this perspective, but it was only kind of the top tier research institutions that really had access to the bandwidth and the means to use it. After that happened, we received this kind of response of, this is great, but we don't really know what to do with this. And we started to publish essentially data sets out of the University of Michigan, where we would crawl the entire IPv4 address space on various protocols and essentially do protocol handshakes. So essentially we'd connect to port 443 on all open hosts once a week. We would do a standard TLS handshake, and we would record all details of the handshake. This would be everything from the random numbers that were provided to what cipher suite is being used, what content is being provided over HTTP, to essentially start to better understand the host on the internet. As time went on, people said, this is still really hard. You gave me an 800 gigabyte file for each day that you scanned, and you said, go look at this for over the past year. And so the next step of that was we released a tool called Census, C-E-N-S-Y-S, which essentially is a query engine on top of this data. So we still go out and we do these scans on a regular basis of these protocols, but it allows researchers to essentially run SQL and say, I want to look at the snapshot in time of the internet for each week that you scanned. And we've been using this for a variety of things. They were used for finding the last several TLS vulnerabilities. We've been working with browsers to essentially say, these are the websites that will go away when a feature is deprecated. And other researchers are using this for everything from censorship measurement to embedded device security. Where the projects are at today, I think ZMAP, as what ZMAP does in the IPv4 address space, is fairly stable. I think the big question on that layer is, what do we do about IPv6? IPv6 is so much larger, the kind of the brute force approach is never going to work. It's going to need to be a much more calculated, kind of statistically driven approach of, given how we've seen devices have been deployed and how IPs have been allocated, what % coverage can we gain given certain scan times? And we're still working on what do those numbers exactly look like, and then how do we essentially give users a tool that they can actually use that isn't kind of research grade quality code that kind of works, kind of doesn't. You have to have these 7 data sources. We really want to get to the point where researchers everywhere can use it. And the kind of, I think the more difficult piece are the layers above right now. What do we do about all these application layer protocols? And the layer above that is how do we identify what all these devices are? We've gotten to the point where it's not just a couple of software implementations out there. What's much more interesting are the embedded devices. It's the thousands of companies that are releasing these broken products, and how do we actually have a tractable way of figuring out what these devices are and what we do about them. And so we've kind of started down this process of manually tagging devices and saying, well, this is a UPS, and this is a SCADA controller, and that's helpful to like sort groups, but it's really not, the manual approach is not going to be tractable. So I think what we're looking at that point right now is how do we take a little bit more programmatic or machine learning driven approach of trying to actually identify what the devices are and what we should do with that data. So that's where I think things are. Census continues to kind of move along. People propose things, people add protocols at times. We're always looking for help on essentially maintaining and adding new protocols people are looking for. But that's where I think things are at unless people have specific questions.
And now we're really done. If you know where the blue sheets are, could you bring them up to the front, please? And if you haven't signed the blue sheet, please do so before you leave the room. Thank you.